Hello and welcome to another program of the Ship Intelligence Report. This is your humble recovering CI officer, Kevin Shipp, coming to you from the Ascent Studios located somewhere deep in the woods and vines of the southeastern United States. My guest today on the program, which I'm really good to have, is Donald Jeffries. Donald Jeffries is the author of Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, which has been endorsed, by the way, by Ron Paul, who's another kind of hero of mine, a straight out constitutionalist who has never bended in his position. And Ron has endorsed Donald's book. So I want to bring on Donald Jeffries, and Donald and I have a little bit of history going back to a little group of misfits in an elementary school called Woodburn Elementary. You remember that?
Yes, I do. I can't forget that. It's hard to believe we both took the same wayward path down the rabbit holes.
Isn't that something? It's bizarre how things work out, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Well, Don, it's good to have you on again, and it's great to see you. And what I want to talk about, of course, is your book, the recent book, Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, which I recommend everybody read. It's very well written, and I have to say, it's real comfortable on the eyes, and something that you look forward to reading to and going back to the chapters and reading them again. So kudos on that. It's very well written.
Thank you.
Very well presented. And I want to start off talking about something that's kind of near and dear to me, and that you have a section on the slandering of Jefferson, the slandering of Thomas Jefferson. Tell us about that. Tell us your research and what you found and what's in your book regarding that.
Well, like you, Thomas Jefferson has always been one of my great heroes, from the time I was a child. And this whole era of the Revolutionary War has fascinated me since I was a little kid. I don't know if you were checking out those books in the library then or not, but my first kind of forays into nonfiction as a little kid were reading everything I could about the founding of the Republic, the War for Independence, Patrick Henry's stirring speech. And I think I was drawn to Jefferson initially because his name was close to mine, Jeffries. It was the closest thing I could find to a historical figure. So, and then knowing that he wrote the Declaration of Independence and those stirring words and just how brilliant he was. And later, of course, I would come to appreciate him when one of my other heroes, John F. Kennedy, famously said during a state dinner at the White House, where he had assembled a bunch of musicians and artists, great entertainers. And he said, this is the greatest assemblage of talents that has ever been assembled together in the White House with a possible exception, and when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. And I think that's how classical liberals used to look at Jefferson, as a hero. And
Yeah.
the slandering of Jefferson is because he has been now what's left of the left, whatever you call that today, is turned away from Jefferson. And if they talk about him at all, they dismiss him as racist. They bought the Sally Hemings story, hook, line, and sinker, when the DNA evidence has not proven that at all. But you would not know that from the way even Monticello out here, near us, the Monticello, you go on the Monticello tours now, and they talk about Sally Hemings as if it's fact, and that Thomas Jefferson fathered her children. When in fact, if the DNA test showed anything at all, they showed that one Jefferson male, and it could have been 20-some people, not just Thomas Jefferson, fathered one of her children, none of the others. The DNA excluded him on the others, but they still continue to say, and they even talk about him raping her because she bore a child when she accompanied him to Paris as a teenager, but they've already shown that that baby couldn't have been Jefferson's, but they continue to say that he raped her and fathered her child, it's just ridiculous. I find it incredible that a man is probably the greatest statesman we've ever had, one of the most brilliant, and a figure of the Enlightenment, really. This was one of the greatest figures in the history of the world, and accomplished, an inventor, writer, architect, just incredible person, that he's now just being consigned to just being called a racist. And if he's mentioned at all, it's mentioned kind of as a second fiddle to Sally Hemings. And I just find that sad, because this is a man, if we look at his words, and I quoted his from the Declaration of Independence and Hidden History, I talked about how when he talked about a series of events, usurpations and events that all lead to the same cause, definition of conspiracy, because he was talking about what King George was doing, which is nothing compared to the tyranny we've been living under for decades. That was a walk in the park. So if and I think that's why he's being slandered, especially because they don't want people listening to what he said. Anytime people have decide that they no longer want the government, they have a right to alter or abolish it. Does anyone in America believe that now, that we can alter or abolish it? Does anyone believe his sentiments about the tree of liberty needs to be watered with the blood of tyrants tyrants and the patriots every 20 years? He's said so many things on there. That banks are more dangerous to the liberties than anything else, and that where the great line about where the people fear the government, there's tyranny. Where the government fears the people, there's liberty.
Right.
And we clearly, I know, it's pretty obvious to anybody who's awake out there, what condition we have today. It's not liberty.
In this chapter, especially this section on slandering Jefferson, Donald, I think you just absolutely nailed it. And I want this to kind of sit out there for our viewers and everybody that's watching this and hear what you just said about Thomas Jefferson and what they're doing, reputation, and more importantly, as important, why they're doing it, because they don't want the Thomas Jefferson mindset existing amongst we the people these days because of their power hierarchy. And you just wrote that so beautifully. I'm glad you did, because of all, they've even talked about removing the statue of Jefferson in the Jefferson Memorial, which, because of this deception and propaganda that's been put out there and fostered by the mainstream media, which you so well point out in your book and here, is a fabrication. It's not true.
No, it isn't, because this is a guy who, he's basically associated with slavery, when in fact, he was the most eloquent voice against slavery. Now, yes, he did own slaves, but it's a complex issue. First of all, this was kind of an economic necessity. Most people don't know about Jefferson, that despite his great and eloquent words on financial matters, banks, and so forth, like a lot of us, he couldn't unfortunately practice what he preached in terms of how he handled his money. He wasn't good handling money. He was very generous to people. He was constantly in debt. So there was an economic reason he needed the slaves. That's why he didn't free them immediately, or his death, like George Washington did. George Washington was in better financial shape than Jefferson was. And he also understood that when they would be freed, and we saw how when they were in fact freed, the kind of mess that ensued, as Ron Paul, who wrote the foreword to this book, said that 100 years, that it led to 100 years of bad race relations, and it did. That's when real racism was born. And Jefferson understood that you don't just throw everybody into the deep end. These are people that were forbidden to read and write in most cases. They had no skills beyond picking cotton and doing common labor. So you couldn't suddenly just say you're free to go out in society, and you couldn't expect the real white supremacists, because let's face it, everybody was a white supremacist in the late 1800s and by our standards today, there wasn't any white person that wasn't a racist. So to call Jefferson one like he was an anomaly is ridiculous. But he understood that when you did that, the problems that would ensue. So he had a graduated plan where he wanted to, up to a certain, gradually start educating them, and up to a certain point, any slave child born after that date was born free. That made more sense. But of course, we didn't do it that way. Abraham Lincoln's and the radical Republicans' horrible plan, combined with the military occupation of the South and the Reconstruction, produced the Jim Crow laws and the separate but equal and the Ku Klux Klan and all these things that that we're still trying to deal with. But it was all because they didn't listen to wiser heads like Jefferson, who I point out in the book, he had a very strong condemnation of the slave trade that was edited out, like a lot of things were edited out of the Declaration of Independence.
Right, that's
right.
right.
So if he was for slavery, I don't know who was. And of course, I also try to contrast the way he's been treated by what I call the court historians, or the gatekeepers of the past. They're like the mainstream journalists of today. They lie about the past as opposed to the journalists today are lying about current events. But Alexander Hamilton is the only founding father that the establishment loves. He's become a hip black young rapper on Broadway now, and it's no coincidence that he was the banker's favorite founding father. He fought for a central bank. If he was alive today, he'd be going to Bilderberg meetings, probably going to Bohemian Grove, be a member of the CFR. And he but there's this guy, and he also was the father of debt. He built our unbelievably bad financial foundation when he had the federal government assume all the debt from the various states with people like Jefferson. That was what the debate was in the early years of the Republic. It were the Jeffersonians who became the Democrats, and the Federalists who become the Republicans like Hamilton. They were basically arguing about, Jefferson and others said, we don't want a central bank. This is not good. And of course, later they would win completely in 1913 with the birth of the Federal Reserve, and we're still living under that counterfeit money system. But Jefferson is the one who should be the hero to Americans. And unfortunately, they've been brainwashed. They're going to Hamilton, and I'd like to. I said many times, I'd like to have a poll taken of some of these people that are paying huge amounts of money to go see this ridiculous play on Broadway, and see how many actually would think that Hamilton was a black. I mean, that's how uninformed most Americans are about history. But Jefferson's been treated horribly. All the founding fathers have, but I think he was the brightest of what was truly the greatest generation. But yeah, so the slandering of Jefferson is something I feel very strongly about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Donald. And you make another great point. They did two wrongs to Black Americans back then. Two wrongs. One was slavery. And then the second is when they freed them, they just threw them out on the street with no education, no job skills, no way to provide for themselves. And they created a poor Black class because they didn't give them what they needed to survive. And that was Jefferson's aim, was to graduate them in there so that wouldn't happen. Well, the society did, just threw them out in the street, created an entire culture of poverty in doing so. It was just another stupid government way of handling things when it could have been done better. And let me show you something that I've put in a speech in the past. You'll get a kick out of. The Declaration of Independence, as you know, one of the greatest documents obviously ever written in the government of mankind. But here it is right here, the Declaration of Independence, and I've got in bold some of the things that you talked about. We've been endowed by our Creator and deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and it's the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government if it becomes tyrannical. Now, if the Declaration of Independence was written today and disseminated and the government got its hands on it, this is what it would look like. Which looks like part of my first book, that the CIA tried to black out all the unclassified stuff. That was embarrassing to them. So you're so right on that, and it's important for people to, I think, read this chapter in your book and understand this is, and one of the things I do almost full time, exposing the deep state and the shadow government. This is another deep state historical slant on things to keep Jefferson quiet, because everything he taught and wrote is against the deep state, shadow government, which is the intelligence agencies. Everything that he wrote is against the central banks and the loss of our freedom in 1913 with the establishment of the Federal Reserve. So the deep state wants Thomas Jefferson silenced and sequestered. And like you said, they want to bring out Hamilton because he's the big banker. And the central banker, and kind of more of a deep state kind of thing. So that's a powerful point. Both points that you've made in regards to Jefferson are critically important. The next thing I want to go, and I have to say my next favorite chapter in your book is our revolutionary legacy. Yeah. And there's a lot of meat in this baby here. So we want to kind of dissect it down a little bit. And let me start with a quote from your book. The founding fathers would be mortified at what has become of their republic and would be marginalized as wacko extremists, like the Declaration of Independence I just showed everybody, by the mainstream media and their political descendants. Then you talk about the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute training guide. Could you tell everybody about that?
I think that was when Alex Jones was doing some great stuff. I don't know if it was I think it was more than one. I think it were local police forces did the same thing, but basically they were showing a video and instructing their officers that the founding fathers could be defined as terrorists. And it was going against but this is the mantra that we have today. And I wrote in the book, I think I'm the first one to point out, I'm a film buff as well. I'm writing a book about showbiz now. And I know a lot about old movies. And one thing I found fascinating is that there's never been a biopic of George Washington. There's never been a biopic of Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Patrick Henry, the Adams, other than Alexander Hamilton. Of course, he had one even then. But I find this very curious, and I think it's because even Hollywood, if you remember, Mel Gibson made the movie The Patriot back in the late 90s,
Yeah,
and it
right.
caused a huge controversy.
Yeah,
And
right.
this is because when you're looking at that Declaration of Independence, we have to look at what our real history is. Hollywood, the establishment, they just prefer to steer completely clear of that era because it's impossible really to honestly look at it without talk of overthrowing tyranny,
Mm-hmm.
without talk of, we can't, the consent of the governed, for instance. Now, the consent of the governed was one of the main precepts of the revolution. And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, as you know, I wrote a lot about Lincoln in the Civil
Yeah.
War, that after the Civil War, because the southern states clearly no longer consented, and by any definition. So after they were completely crushed and almost 1 million people died because of it, that was lost forever because clearly our government said at that time, no, this is not a voluntary union. So even if you don't consent to be governed, that's too bad. So we still have kind of this really it's anachronism now, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, because our leaders don't pay attention to it because Lincoln became the new secular saint. And most people don't know, for instance, that Lincoln despised Thomas Jefferson, especially.
Mm-hmm.
He
Yep.
didn't like the found, and I'm sure Thomas Jefferson would have despised him. So it disappoints me when I hear so many people kind of put the Lincoln with the founding fathers because he's the antithesis of the founding fathers. A lot of people rightly called what happened under Lincoln the Second American Revolution. So I think since that time, when we look back at history, the court historians and the Hollywood, they kind of prefer to start with Lincoln. They kind of ignore everything that happened before because they don't want to go into that era. Because if you read the Declaration of Independence and look at some of the complaints, people today would say, well, wait a minute, we're living under a counterfeit money system. We have free speech zones. You have people like Roger Stone, who wrote the foreword to my book Hidden History, that are being facing prison time for nothing. Yeah. We have absolute tyranny. Pre-dawn raids like at his home. This is absolute tyranny, and as compared to what they were experiencing then, they'd be doing a lot more than throwing tea into a harbor if they were around today. So I think they just want to steer clear of that, and let's start with Abraham Lincoln and make him a secular saint. And if we talk about the founding fathers at all, we'll mention George Washington, and George Washington still gets relatively good press. But Jefferson especially, George Mason, who you don't hear about, because he was responsible for pushing the Bill of Rights through. Mm-hmm. And Patrick Henry is completely forgotten. Patrick Henry was among those who really didn't even support the Constitution because the Bill of Rights got a lot of these people on board, but they thought that was even giving the central government too much power. But after Lincoln, the federal government became the focus, and most people don't realize that it was the United States, plural, before the Civil War. Ever since then, it's been the United States singular. So we lost something, and most Americans don't even realize it. So hopefully they'll read my book and become a little enlightened at least.
Yeah, amen to that. And the chapter on Abraham Lincoln, I'd recommend people read because they need to know what Abraham Lincoln was really about and what really happened during his presidency and how history has not accurately reported that. And you're absolutely right. Lincoln was the antithesis to Thomas Jefferson. I'm so glad in your book that you bring that out because no one else, at least that I have read, has done that yet. And so what you've done is I think kind of the first of its kind in bringing this out in the plain view.
Well, Thomas de Lorenzo wrote a few great books, Lincoln Unmasked, and I was influenced by him. But I think putting it all together and also putting it in the context of the difference between the founding fathers and Lincoln. And you said that most people just dismiss the founding fathers now. And I don't think, Kevin, there's ever been a situation like we're experiencing today in the history of the world where we have the framework of the government is still intact. And I believe the Constitution with the Bill of Rights is the most perfect, and the checks and balances is the most perfect form of government that can be devised.
I agree.
It's the problem the people that are running it are awful, but the people that run it now, they all swear allegiance to the Constitution, but they obviously don't believe in any part of it. They don't believe in free speech. I don't think anybody believes in it. I'm a civil libertarian, so I'm constantly taking up for people that I disagree with. And that was the idea. Free speech means nothing if you don't support the speech of those you disagree with. But most people today want to get people fired for saying something they don't like, or they want to throw them in jail.
Yeah.
That's not free speech.
Yeah, bigot, racist,
Yes,
Islamophobe,
yes, yes.
misogynist, and there's even one speciesist. If you're gonna, that's someone who believes that the
Yeah,
human race is superior to other
yeah, boy.
animals. So you so throwing out labels to silence speech, and
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. There's people out there that are saying things that I strongly disagree with, but like I will fight for their right to do that,
yeah.
because
Right.
if we lose that, and we're losing it,
Yeah,
we're losing it. If we lose freedom of speech, assembly, and religion, then we're done. And it's happening right before our eyes. It's happening. And people, I can tell you this, what has been missing is a populace like the founders were, and the Americans who participated, which sadly were the minority of Americans that
yeah,
participated in the actual battles, a small percentage. But we're starting to see today people kind of getting at least fired up and motivated and fed up. Thanks to books like yours, and God willing, some of the stuff hopefully that I'm putting out there and others. So it's starting to happen. The sad part is, though, Donald, which you probably agree with, is people are still so wrapped up in their own survival and their health insurance and their pension and their retirement, and
yeah,
and millions, and I talk about this in my shadow government speech, millions of people work for or are supported by the federal government, their health
yeah.
insurance, their retirement, and
Absolutely.
they're in debt to the banking system. So, it's a slavery. So it's a new kind of slavery that a lot of Americans are in. And what I talk about regularly is people have got to understand they're going to have to think about sacrifice, because we're in a really bad situation right now in terms of our freedoms. And people have got to think about sacrifice and what they may have to do in the case of the Second Amendment now, as in your
Yeah.
state, my former state,
Yes.
Virginia, goodness
Yeah.
gracious,
Yeah.
and things there that are getting worse. But people are starting to get more motivated than I've seen in the almost 30 years that I've been talking about this stuff, and you yourself also. All right, so let's go on here. And you talk about the Second Amendment. This is a great chapter because we hear now when they're trying to remove that right that, well, the Second Amendment just applied to a militia. Well, we have the Army today, so we don't need a militia. So these are a bunch of gun-toting fanatics. Talk about that, because you explain that really, really well in your book.
Yeah. I mean, I just, and all I did, everything I write, Kevin, it's easy to find. This material's out there in plain sight. They're not hiding it. It's just that the court historians that write about it, they don't include it, and they interpret it wrong, much as the talking heads on television interpret things for the masses.
Yeah.
We'll do the thinking for you. Anybody that looks at the statements, even Alexander Hamilton, every single one of the founders is on the record clearly saying that this is about the individual right to bear arms. And they talk about how other governments don't let people have guns. And this is, I think, was it Jefferson of Washington said, without the Second Amendment makes the First Amendment possible. And these things are very important, but we have got, the court historians and the talking heads have got you thinking about militias. And I do wish that the founders would have been a little clearer in the way they worded it, because, when you look at their conversations and they're what they've left behind on the record, they were very clear. So if they'd been a little clear, because most people aren't going to take the time to look up those things, but anybody that looks at the quotes, and I include a bunch of them in the book, and there's no doubt there is nobody on the other side back then, even Alexander Hamilton, that was arguing, well, we can't let the people have that. And certainly the argument now would be because weapons have improved, and so we're talking about muskets back then. But clearly, I think they may have taken that into account, that we'll probably have bigger and better weapons. But you can't. My favorite thing, Kevin, is to say, I would love to, if there was a way, I would love to ban all guns, because they're deadly. But that would mean taking them from the military and the police. And that's where you get them, because they don't ever want to take away any. So if you're going to let a police force be armed, and you have the biggest military force the world has ever seen, that we have in our military industrial complex, how can you possibly not let the people have arms? And I firmly believe in living in Virginia. I know, because they just backed down again. They were trying to pass a bill and they lost.
Yeah, right.
And I think the only thing keeping them even 0.1% honest is that Second Amendment, because they are scared of the people, those good old boys out in the country that have, that have a lot of weapons, first of all, they're better shots than certainly the police
Yeah.
are.
No, I can
And
testify to that. Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
so so do you want to be the one that's told to go confiscate them?
Hmm.
And the ironic thing about the Second Amendment people, a lot of them don't agree with people like you or me on other issues. They're not really, but don't take their guns. And that's why they're very important, because
Yeah.
that's where you see the real passion. The people that are for gun supporters, you don't mess with them. And that's I wish we had that many people that were First Amendment supporters.
Yeah.
We just don't, or
Yeah.
anti-war people.
Yeah.
We just don't have it. So thank goodness for them, because I'm not a real gun guy, but obviously I support the Second Amendment, and I respect the fact they're there, because as Orwell said in 1984, if there's any hope, it lies in the proles. Well, I would say if there's any hope, it lies in the Second Amendment people, because they're what's keeping them really off our doorstep.
I couldn't agree with you more. And, I was a police officer when I started out with the federal government, and then a CI officer, and then I was on a counter assault team and a SWAT team. And, I spent a lot of my career carrying firearms either here or elsewhere. And, it got old. It was a tool that we had to qualify on regularly, which is a real pain in our neck.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'm not a real gun fan, because it was just something we had to do. And I saw during those years what guns and weapons can do, and it can be really horrific. And I'm a libertarian myself, and a real peace activist, but that peace comes from a strong people, and an armed people. And these people, I live out in someplace deep in the southeastern United States, and this studio here is kind of hidden away. And so I interact with a lot of my wife's relatives here in the South. And I'm a Northerner, and it took me a good year to kind of acclimate a little bit, because I was in the fast lane and came down here. But I can tell you that these people down here, firearms are a part of their life, and none of them carry them around acting like they're a badass.
Right.
None of them talk about their guns all the time or how they want to use them against Washington. They're a tool for these people. Right. They hunt with them. They have them in their house for self-defense, which they should. But guns are not foremost in their minds. And I'm talking country people down here, an average citizen. So the picture of Johnny Billy Bob who clings to his gun and his Bible is a bunch of baloney, or that these rednecks are all about guns and guns. It's simply, it's a picture painted by the anti-Second Amendment types, amongst other pieces of propaganda. But man, you are so right. It is the right to bear arms amongst the people in this country that is maybe the only check against government tyranny, because the government is on the verge of tyranny every single day in this country. I come from the belly of the beast. I've seen it personally. You've written about it. And just remove one protection, one strength that the people has, like arms, just take that away and watch what the government does. Government will go bad every single time. It will go tyrannical every single time. You give a human being power, more power than he or she should have, and that person can become a monster. I saw that in the CIA. So, people, they don't function well with power and in government.
No, and that's why, Lord Acton is one of my heroes. And he had the great saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Most people don't know Lord Acton was a great populist, classical liberal in Britain, and he corresponded regularly with Robert E. Lee. There's some great letters back. He supported the Confederacy because he understood what was at stake there. This was the consent of the governed, is what we fought a revolution on. And unfortunately, that concept lost, and people are those that are condemned, that are forget history, condemned to repeat it, as Santayana said. History is past is prologue, as Shakespeare said, and we've already had so much chipping away of our rights. Like most people, for instance, when you hear a lot of the opposition to the people that want to, the gun grabbers, whatever you call them, they typically start out, well, no one needs an AK-47. You can't hunt deer with an AK, that kind of stuff. Well, those are the kind of infringements that, the slippery slope, and that's gradualism. We see this in free speech. Most people don't, and I discovered this myself, during research, sometimes I learned something that I didn't know. When I was just writing about World War I era, And the fact that, Lincoln set so many precedents, and one of them was that when he threw thousands of prisoners, northern people, into makeshift prisons for opposing his policies, suspended the writ of habeas corpus, shut down hundreds of newspapers. But doing that, Woodrow Wilson used his precedent to throw World War I protesters like Eugene Debs into prison.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, they challenged it. The Supreme Court, under the great liberal Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a eugenicist like almost all the liberals, going back as far as so-called liberals, they want to kill millions of people. This is they want the right people to survive. They're on the record, all the way down to Bill Gates. But
Mm-hmm.
his
Yeah.
Supreme Court decision, when people hear that expression, well, of course we have free speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That comes from his Supreme Court decision. He used that term to justify Woodrow Wilson throwing protesters in jail. And I'm fond of saying in all my interviews now, Eugene Debs and the other World War I protesters were not yelling fire in a crowded theater.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so that's what you do. You use that and you justify something entirely different.
Yeah.
Clearly, they weren't doing anything. They were protesting a war, which was the first real step to globalism. It was disastrous for us doing that. And it still is used. People parrot that phrase. I try to educate them, and they just give you a bland. That's the hardest part, is when you try to explain to people these kinds of things, and because it's, as a civil libertarian, I'm a free speech purist, and so I'm always defending people's speech that I disagree with, and I also try to defend the rights of those. Like, for instance, this guy, not only is I defending Roger Stone and his ridiculous sentence, but Roger Stone's connected to me, and in some way, being writing the forward to my book. But somebody who I genuinely don't like, this sleazy lawyer Michael Avenatti, the story. Well, I think it was ridiculous for him to get a possible 40-some years, and I said that. I think this is outrageous. I don't like the guy, but you have to stand up. If you don't do that, then that's what tyranny's built on, and that's the beauty of what our founders. First of all, they understood Lord Acton, although he came after them. They understood that power corrupts. So with the checks and balances, the idea was that no power could consolidate in any of the three branches without the other two checking it. But the problem is, early on, the Supreme Court, the judiciary, under John Marshall, of course, is considered a legendary figure, but he just went ahead and decided, no, we're going to interpret the Constitution. He did things Jefferson talked about that he didn't want them doing. So the judiciary became too powerful right off the bat. And then with Lincoln's first imperial presidency, he overstepped as he just tread all over the Constitution, and the executive branch became way too powerful. The legislative branch has always lagged behind, and that's the one, if any of the three should be more powerful, it should be that one, because they're the one most responsive to the people, especially the House. We can theoretically vote them out every 2 years. We don't. We keep bringing the same clowns back in, whether it's voter fraud or just voter stupidity. Either one, it's bad. But So now we have a situation now where the legislative branch has been a rubber stamp for the executive and the judicial branch for far too long. So we don't have those checks and balances that we should have, and we can't allow the central government having all this power, which started under Lincoln and more consolidated under FDR and almost everybody since then. People don't realize that we built this gargantuan thing. And no, but do you hear any conservatives now? Conservatives used to, up until Reagan, they talked, and even Reagan talked about big government, but he never even cut a single sub-agency in 8 years. Conservatives stop talking about that. You don't see it. Is anybody? They don't talk about, and they don't talk about anti-communism, the stuff that they were built on. Instead, they talk about the war on terror, and they demonize socialism. And Tucker Carlson is fond of saying, and I say it all the time. The reason somebody like Bernie Sanders is so popular now is because our system, whatever it is, it sure isn't free enterprise, and it was not the way it was intended to be. It's a corrupt marketplace
run by the banks and debt. Yeah, that's
exactly. And it's failing the vast majority of people, especially young people. So of course they're going to be attracted if they're saddled with college loan debt that they can't almost never repay.
Well, people are suffering.
Yes,
you're right. And if you look at what we spend on defense and the intelligence budget, secret intelligence budget, which is a whole nother issue we'll talk about sometime. But if you look at the bases that we have overseas that are not necessary, of course, there's $21 trillion from the defense budget that's missing and has been moved under national security. But if you look at that amount of money and you stop that and you moved it over to help the people and for real health insurance and programs to help the poor and the needy, we wouldn't have a problem in the United
No.
States with people being homeless or going bankrupt when they get a very serious disease. But yeah, people are hurting. They're
Yeah.
suffering out there. And that's why Sanders, and I'm not a Sanders supporter, but that's why Sanders appeals to these people, because
Sure.
they're hurting and they're suffering, or even their moms and dads have gone bankrupt because of medical bills. And the government, and you know, I'm a conservative in terms of, I guess, maybe social issues that you could
Hmm.
say. But I can tell you this, the Republican Party has not done anything about these topics.
No.
As a matter of fact, they keep saying that, well, we got to get rid of these entitlement programs. They've stolen from Social Security
Yeah,
and
exactly.
bankrupted it. They got to get rid of Medicare, which all of us have put our own money into
That's
for
right.
decades, and they
Exactly.
want to steal it. You know, these are Republicans talking about these things.
Yeah.
I'm an independent, by the way.
Yeah.
I
Well, I
was
mean,
a Go ahead.
no, well, yeah, I mean, and that's the choice. We have such a deadly choice, and that's why it's hard for me. I give all these interviews, and I'm people don't understand me a lot of times, but I'm saying, you know, Huey Long is still my political hero, and he called them Tweedledum and Tweedledee, High Papa Low 'em and Low Papa High 'em. That's what they are. There's no, they disagree on transgender bathrooms and issues like that. They're arguing over things that don't matter to most people. They all go for war. None of them talk about the counterfeit money system. And none of them talk about the disparity of wealth. Now, I'm not a socialist, not a communist. Although I sound like one a lot, apparently. But I'm writing a postscript for Survival of the Richest, which is coming out in paperback in a few months. And Naomi Wolf, who's a great classical liberal who supports my work, and she's going to write a foreword to it. But I found in doing that, I found a stat that one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. There's people don't realize how much wealth is in this country. If you divided up all the wealth, the known wealth, because there's unknown wealth in the foundations and offshore, the known wealth in this country, if you divided it up equally, come to $343,000 for every man, woman, and child. Now, of course, that's not practical, it's not fair, but it shows you how much is there and why there's no reason for anybody to be living on the streets or to be, you know, something
Yeah.
like California that has become an absolute third world cesspool
Yeah.
where it
Yeah.
looks worse than, and nobody's doing anything about it. We're
Yeah.
allowing this to happen, and we have to do something. And that's why, as long as that situation exists, people know. And so somebody like Bernie Sanders talks about it, they're going to respond to that, because you can't just respond to that by saying America's great and, you know, the economy's booming and all this stuff. Well, even the stock market. I mean, I have a stake in the stock market, but most people don't. 90%
Right.
of the
That's
stocks are
right.
owned by 10% of the people.
That's right. Yep.
That bottom half of the country has nothing.
Yep.
The bottom 50% make less than $27,000 a year. Nobody's talking to them, and so I think you have to offer alternatives if this system works well. And you and I grew up in the only real era where the middle class existed. The middle class was really born in that post-war economy, and it was born with high tax rates on the wealthy. The wealthy at one point were paying a 90% tax rate. Under the Eisenhower administration, when the last infrastructure rebuild happened, we haven't touched it for 60 years, but all this happened then. And you and I experienced a childhood like no other Americans ever have, when really
Yeah, that's right.
any job
Yeah.
paid enough for
Yeah.
the man to support a wife who had stayed at home and as many kids as they wanted. You know, you could work at Sears and Roebuck and
Or a gas station. Yeah.
or gas station anywhere. I mean, I knew fathers of kids that did that, and they lived in a house. They were okay. The mother didn't work. They had they had many kids. It was a different economy. That was when you had the middle class, where it really was. If you were willing to work hard, then you could move up. There was upward mobility.
That's right.
There is no upward mobility now, and
No.
it's we have to do something about it. And there's lots. It's very complex. The immigration, I'm still waiting for Trump to do something about. That's a huge part of it. The trade deals, which again, we'll see what happens there. We have to do something, but sooner or later, somebody has to say. I mean, the minimum wage hasn't been raised in forever. And that's not the only answer, but you have to do something, because people are, and that I think that's when even get to something like analyzing history. People, first of all, they're not going to be interested in history if they're struggling to survive and 70-some% living paycheck to paycheck. And so I kind of get my economics and history, but I think they're intertwined, you know, because.
Oh yeah, yeah, sure. And another thing too, and kind of a pet peeve. You have gazillionaires, billionaires out there like Bill Gates, now Jeff Bezos, not one of my favorite people. Now an arm of the CIA with his contract and the cloud and everything else. But now the richest man on earth, and they all talk about climate change and this and that, and that's a whole separate issue. I don't want to go there. But if these people just took 0.001% of their wealth and gave it to the poor or the homeless, them combined could clean up that problem. But and this is the nature of people and greed, and they don't do that. Bezos just bought this massively ridiculous house. With I forget what the price was, but it's astronomical price for this big house for him to live in. So they talk this big game, and Bill Gates included, but none of them help the poor. And I think the heart of a free society, just my opinion, is helping the poor and helping the people that are suffering. And that's one of the cornerstones of freedom. And so the government's not doing it. The rich and the elite are not doing it. And as you and I are saying, there are people out there that are really, really hurting.
They really are, and Amazon pays no taxes as well, as you know, and Amazon is interfering with my books. I found out my new book. I have a book coming out just in a few days officially, and that's called Bullyocracy. It's about bullying in schools. How the social hierarchy enables bullies to rule schools, workplaces, and society at large. A little bit different. Jesse Ventura wrote a nice blurb for it. So, but I have a different publisher. It's Prime Day that I've never had before. They're a little smaller, but they gave me a little bit better deal. And but I found out that Amazon is playing games with them, especially because they publish a lot of controversial books like Skyhorse does, my other publisher. What Amazon does is they will order excessive copies. Now, hopefully it doesn't happen to my books. I hope it'll sell well, but a lot of their books don't sell that well. They'll order a bunch of copies that they know are not going to sell. And then they have this return policy that they saddle the publisher with. So they have this huge amount they have to pay, and they're trying to put them out of business doing that.
Man, you know what they did to me? Of course, I had to battle the CIA to get my book out, and eventually I just came out full bore and just exposed everything they blacked out, and that was my freedom moment. But my book, I got it through the CIA, and I did that by forming my own publishing company, and then publishing it and putting it out there, and then saying, okay, now what are you going to do? Well, there's nothing they could do because what they blacked out was criminal. Anyway, but what Amazon did to me, Donald, is we get this order of 52 books. Somebody ordered 52 books. And then, so we put it in our balance sheet, and then 2 weeks later, all those 52 books were returned. And somebody at Amazon, they're playing games with me, try to stick it to you. So the same thing happened to me, even though I'm my own publisher, the book's on Amazon. So somehow someone ordered 52 books and then turned around 2 weeks later and returned all 52 and messed up our balance sheet. So exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and it's an effort. There's so much, and publishers like that are very important because I'm dissatisfied with my, and I'm finding out writing about show business how I understand how so many artists from the past were ripped off, especially in music, because the royalty rates, the performer, the artist, the creator is screwed constantly. They get a very small fraction of it, so I can feel for that, but my choices are limited because with what I write. I mean, I know I can write, but the problem is it's what I write, not how I write. And so because the topics I go after, the controversial ones, I'm limited basically to 2 or 3 publishers that will probably, there's even any point in asking because they're not going to do it. And so that's the situation. Thank goodness we have them. So if one of them is driven out of business, I don't know what we're going to do. And we're also dealing with a limited amount of readers now. People don't read. Hidden History has been my most successful book. And I was talking to Led Kolodny a while back who wrote Silent Coup. He's a great guy. He was talking about how Silent Coup, I think, sold 750,000 copies or something back in the late 80s, wherever it was, early. So something like Hidden History back then, as successful as it's been now, it would have sold maybe 500,000 copies. Easily. Yeah. So I would have been able to make a nice living doing that because there were that many more readers then. So that's the reality we have to face. We're writing books kind of, I guess, at a wrong time. That's why I'm, trying to do my little podcast and trying to do other
Exactly.
things, because you try to get the information out to people however you can, because the idea is trying to wake them up. But I think writing about history, it's important, because if people understand these things, they know how things happen, that some of the things we see, some of the things Lincoln did that we still see as recently as George W. Bush, using Lincoln's precedent for the treatment of the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. He's still cited. And, things FDR used the precedent to lock the Japanese and the German Americans and Italian Americans that they don't talk about. They were locked up too. They didn't get reparations, but they're all used as once these things happen. And so the free speech issue, they can use Oliver Wendell Holmes' ridiculous fire in a crowded theater decision, which had nothing to do with anybody, inciting something like that everybody would understand. Yeah, it's not right to yell fire in a crowded theater when there isn't one. Clearly, protesting war isn't doing that. So people need to look at how these things come into being. They need to educate themselves about when they hear these expressions or these justifications for things that, no, we had a system of government, checks and balances. Originally we were set up. The founders believed that this may just be a temporary thing. If you don't like it, 25 years, hey, come up with something else. As it turned out, a lot of us really admire the complexity of it, or the simplicity, but how great a system it is, comparatively speaking. But it's been corrupted, and it just makes you shake your head in disgust when you look at the people that have corrupted it, and how they still, during the impeachment charade, where you still had the Democrats, it's the one that they didn't explode, talking about the Constitution and the founders. Like, first, they wouldn't even allow the founders in Washington, D.C. As I said, they would be on if we could talk to them, they'd be on podcasts like this, maybe. They might be reading my books or something and sending me an email, but that's as far as the extent they would have.
The Constitution, you're right, the Constitution this, the Constitution that, as they're trampling all over it in this recent impeachment thing. And I think the stock and barf bags must have gone up through that whole process. But you're right. But they're throwing the word the Constitution around, and they wouldn't abide by the founders' principles any more than the man in the moon.
No, they haven't. Their entire careers are a testament to that, because they would understand, first of all, free speech is free speech. They would understand the Second Amendment is Second Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is what it is. I mean, they would be against asset forfeiture laws that the police use all the time that are clearly unconstitutional.
That's right.
But the Supreme Court has ruled. I mean, in one, you probably know about this one memorable case, a woman rightfully was incensed when her husband, which was with a prostitute in her car that she owned. Well, they confiscated the car, as they do all the time in these situations, because it was connected to the crime scene. Like they confiscate houses and so forth, where drug dealers are.
Right.
So she lost her car, and was incensed. So look, not only did I find out my husband was the prostitute, I lost my car. So she naturally appealed that. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that they had the authority to take her car. So what can you do when you have that kind of tyranny? Because, I mean, what kind of judicial minds agree with that? But our whole system is based on that now.
And we're running out of time, but and I want to have you back, because I want to talk about judicial tyranny too, because it's pretty serious. But I'd love to have you come back on, because we got so much more to talk about, man.
Sure.
On this stuff, and if you could, that would be great. Now, you've written. Let me put this up so people. Where can people? The best place to get your books, Donald?
Well, I don't like Amazon, and I talk about them, but Amazon, as for writers, we look, the only way you can gauge how a book is doing, and as opposed to what the statement that the publisher sends you, because I don't have any idea how many books are selling, but you can kind of tell from the Amazon rankings, and Amazon, the ratings they have. So I always ask them if they don't necessarily have to review the book. I'd love that, but now they can just rate it there, and they go by that. And people are, unfortunately, human beings are bandwagon types, whether it's a sports team or anything else. So if they see a lot of ratings for a book, they're going to be drawn to it, even past the subject matter. So history has pretty many, but I'd like to see more of that. It just takes a second to do it. But I always tell people, get the best deal you can. It's available. And most of my books are in Barnes and Noble stores. They have a shelf life there, but they can, order it wherever they can find the best deal. And I don't even ask them to buy it. My books are in lots of libraries all over the world. If your library doesn't have it, suggest that they add it to their collection. I
Good
get a
idea.
sale. I get a sale either way, and it gets in the hands of more readers.
Good
So
idea.
look out for. I'm not going to make much money on an individual sale either way. The idea is to get a groundswell, people realizing it,
Right.
more word of mouth, more and more people telling about it because it is. I do offer a different perspective than you're going to get in most other places.
How about a signed copy? If somebody wants a signed copy, how can they go where you speak, or how can somebody get a signed copy of your book?
Well, when I have book signings, and I do have book signings here or there, and I typically don't travel to do book signings, but I have signed copies for people. I don't get my new publisher. I get more copies, so it'd be easier that way with Bullocracy. But the
Mhm.
other ones usually run out of copies very quick, as far as signed copies. But some people have bought it and mailed it to me, and I signed it and mailed it back to them. I mean, I'm happy to do it. It's just
Mhm.
the logistics of it, if we're not close, are not easy. But I'm
Yeah.
happy to do that for people who figure out a way to do it.
Okay, good. And you have a podcast, did you say,
Yeah,
that you're doing now?
yeah,
Yeah.
you were on it one time. You and Richard Gage. Remember we
Mhm.
did the 9/11 show a while
Yeah,
back.
man.
So it's I Protest, and it comes
Mhm.
on. It's part of the Truth Frequency Network, which is part of iHeartRadio.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I do it every Friday from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern time. Last week I had Richard Jewell's real life lawyer, Watson Bryant. I
Yeah,
saw that
great.
great movie. He's a really cool
Yeah.
guy, and very good movie. So I have a lot of provocative guests, and the other half I usually rant for the second hour. So I don't know what kind of audience it has, but I know it's reaching some people, and that's all we
Good.
can do. I'm not ready for AM or FM, I don't think, in the eyes of the people, but I'd love that. But unfortunately, it's like what you write, it's what I say, and you
Yeah.
understand that it's not whether or not we're qualified or skilled enough at doing it.
Mhm.
It's the material. Well, that's not welcome here. And if we had a true free marketplace, they would look at people like you and I that could easily, host a radio show on a big station and would get maybe a lot of negative attention too, but it would bring ratings.
Yeah.
And if it's all about money and ratings, that should be the driving force, but we know
Yeah.
it's not. There are other factors because otherwise they would go to
Yeah.
the people who can bring the ratings.
Well, maybe we're fans of Tucker Carlson. Maybe Tucker Carlson will have you on Fox News
I hope
one of these times. So we'll just put that out there on this show.
Well, he's not a conspiracy guy at all,
Yeah.
but he's reminding me more and more of Pat Buchanan, where
Mhm.
he's
Yeah.
turning more and more
Yeah.
populist, and I see a
I
lot of. I'm
agree.
surprised they still have him on there. So I'd like to get him on before they take him off the air. To get on there before they take him off the air.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's doing about as good as work as anybody's doing in the mainstream media on television.
I couldn't agree with you more. Now, do you have a website or anything, or
My blog, I write regularly in my blog, and Lou Rockwell, who is Ron Paul's former chief of staff, has
Mhm.
written lots of good. He publishes a lot of my articles.
Mhm.
I had one called America Corrupt that got a lot of play last week. But
Mhm.
my blog is Keeping It Unreal after my novel The Unreals,
Mhm.
and it's donaldjeffries.wordpress.com.
Got it.
You can find it there, and I have lots of followers. Most things get pretty many comments, so I'd figure out a way to monetize it. I'm not very good at making money, kind of like Thomas Jefferson, So I figure out how to do a little better job at that,
Well, it's tough for an author these days, like you said.
Yeah.
But yeah, and also people who subscribe to this channel on Patreon and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you want to find Donald, come to me too, and I can direct you to Donald how to get his books and everything else too. So you can come to patreon.com/Kevin_Shipp or fortheloveoffreedom.net, my website. I have an email address there, and if you want Donald books or you want to get in contact with Donald, you can catch me there, and I'll make sure that I get you contacted. Donald, as we close up, anything last thoughts you want to leave with our audience before we close it out today?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Kevin. It's always great to talk with you. I hope we can talk again. This book alone, we're just talking about one book. We didn't even get barely into the Civil War.
Right.
We didn't get into World War I, the Nuremberg trials. I'm the first one to write critically about the Nuremberg trials, I think, in 60, 70 years, because they were in the antithesis of justice. They were, it was a travesty. But again, the mantra is that was a great thing, and that's why I'm going against the grain. And everything I write, I know I'm going against the grain, whether it's Abraham Lincoln, something like Nuremberg, the founding fathers, where I understand that the court historians are going to be lined up against me. They're going to ignore me, but if they had to obviously confront me, then it would be the same kind of name calling. But I would just hope people would go for these alternative sources, and
I agree.
We need to stop bit burning, which we're trying to stop the YouTube censorship and all that. It's a lot of big YouTubers on board with it. And we've actually retained the attorney. One of the attorneys for Nicholas Sandmann, the Kentucky teenager,
Mm-hmm.
is Todd McMurtry. I've had him on my show, and I don't know what we can do legally, but we have to do something, because the reason we're able to get out there at all is because of the internet. If it wasn't for the internet, nobody would know who we were at all.
Yeah.
And my books maybe would sell a little bit, your books, but we need to keep this so we can have podcasts like this, we can have conversations like this, blogs, because that's what makes the internet great, is that people that are not part of the deep state or the swamp, they can go on a blog and they can give you their perspective, and you'll get something completely different than you're going to get, surfing the FCC controlled airwaves.
Right.
So we don't want the FCC type of control on the internet. We want to keep it free and unfettered. So
that's right.
I would say support your Patreon, support me, support people like that are putting alternative views out there, because that's the only way we're ever going to overthrow this tyranny and make this country what it was intended to be.
I agree. And this really is the new freedom of the press, in my opinion. Podcasts like yours, shows like this, and other podcasts that patriots and people have out there, it's the new freedom of the press. And you're right, that's how we're going to create a groundswell of constitutionalists and patriots in this country. And it's the only way that we're going to get the collective consciousness and collective action of people rising up and saying enough is enough of this deep state and shadow government, the tyranny, and the unconstitutional, outrageous things we're seeing from our government. So to come through the new freedom of the press and through shows like yours and mine and others. And that's the answer, in my opinion, and that's how we're going to do it.
Absolutely. And we have to, as Bobby Kennedy said during one of my favorite expressions was the tiny ripples of hope.
Yeah.
Each time a man stands up against an injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And all those ripples together can form a tidal wave that can break down the mightiest walls of oppression and injustice. So I'm hoping that these tiny ripples of hope, every time you talk, every time you're sending forth a tiny ripple of hope, hopefully my books and articles, and when I talk, they're sending forth tiny ripples of hope. And hopefully we can all come together, wake on one person at a time, and eventually maybe we can break down this tyranny, because it's just like Orwell talked about in 1984. The proles could have overtaken the party at any time. They had them outnumbered, 100 to 1 or whatever. It's the same way with us. The average people, the people that are being screwed by this system, that are being lied to, the system isn't working for them, and they vastly outnumber the people that are ruling us, but we can't get them to come together. They're fighting just as the proles and Orwells were fighting about the lottery and sports and beer, and that's what we're doing as well. So he had great foresight and understanding what was going on, because he would look at America today and he'd, say, yeah, this is what I was talking about, you guys. You must not have read my book.
Yeah. Right. Well said, Donald. Well said. Well, Donald Jeffries, thank you so much for being on the program. And will you come back again? Because we got a lot more ground to cover and things to talk about.
Anytime, Kevin. I love it. Thanks very much.
All right, my friend. Thanks again.
Okay. Take care.
You too.
Okay.